So I thought about doing a video talking about My Little Pony video games, because I've done 2 of them, and I thought maybe I could do these for a bunch of other separate reviews, but the thing that I've noticed is that a lot of these games are kind of similar, so I thought it would be better just to talk about them in one. What's also really surprising is that there's not that many My Little Pony games out there. I mean, there are a couple, but there's not as many as you'd expect. In fact, there aren't even that many when it comes to console. A lot of them are on handheld, there are a lot of them on mobile, and just recently with Gen 5 it seems like we're finally getting console-based versions of these games, but for the most part, a lot of these MLP games aren't as big as you'd expect, which is shocking considering how big of a franchise it is. It's one of Hasbro's biggest mainstays. So with this video, I thought it'd be fun to talk a little bit about all the My Little Pony games that are out there, because I already talked about Runaway Rainbow on Game Boy Advance, and I did talk about Crystal's Ponytails, even though that wasn't technically My Little Pony related, but it was kind of My Little Pony related just based on osmosis, so yeah. Consider this the history of My Little Pony games. The very first My Little Pony video game to ever come out was My Little Pony Friendship Gardens for the PC. This came out in the 90s, when PC gaming was just starting to come into its own, and it was also made during Gen 2. So this is the only G2 My Little Pony video game out there, and it was also the first video game the franchise ever experienced. Now compared to what was to come, this isn't really a My Little Pony adventure game like you'd expect. I mean, even compared to the G3 video games that we'll talk about in a second, this is more just a standard taking care of pony simulator. Like raising ponies, taking them to beauty salons, feeding them, having them run through the racetrack to get their exercise, that kind of thing. This feels more in line with one of those Barbie type games that are all about taking care of ponies. Not really like My Little Pony. But at the same time, we gotta give it some credit for being one of the first of its kind, since it is, after all, the first My Little Pony video game out there, so we gotta give it respect for that. Then come the G3 games, which there's not a whole lot of them, but there is a lot more compared to G2, and surprisingly there's a lot more of these compared to G4. Not gonna lie, I don't know how to feel about that. Now the thing with a lot of these MLP G3 games is that a lot of them are just a bunch of minigame collections. A lot of them involving having to guess a certain number of items on screen, or trying to do puzzles, or trying to get your pony to look fabulous by dressing her up in a certain way. There was a couple of other games that fall into this category. There was a PC game called Play Pack, and then there was one on the DS called Pinkie Pie's Party. And this was on Nintendo DS. Yeah, a lot of these games just play very similarly towards each other, and they're not really different in terms of variety. I mean, a lot of the different minigames are different, and a lot of the quote-unquote story modes are different. Like, Runaway Rainbow is obviously meant to be more like the special in G3 Runaway Rainbow. And then you get to the Friendship is Magic game for Generation 4, and I cannot believe that there's actually not that many games made for this series. A lot of the games were meant to be educational, like this one for Leapfrog, and this one called Twilight Sparkle Teacher for a Day. A lot of these were meant to be educational in nature and teach things like math and English. But there are 2 MLP mobile games that a lot of people might remember. The first one is the one I'm going to talk about the most because I do remember playing it a lot, that being Friendship is Magic on mobile, and a more recent game that came out in the show's later seasons called Pocket Ponies, which played out like a lot of typical freemium games that are based on popular franchises. Now, I know some fans might say, it's a mobile game, it's not very good, or it has a couple of flaws, and you know what, they're right, they're allowed to have their opinion. But gosh darn it, I love these games so much. The plot of it is that Twilight Sparkle comes to Ponyville, but it seems that Nightmare Moon has taken over the land. So Twilight has to fight this by setting up a bunch of shops, making friends with a bunch of ponies who come to the shops, and finding these things called element shards, which are supposed to be the remnants of the elements of harmony. The more you play throughout the game, you can unlock various different members of the main 6, as well as a couple of other characters. As the show went on, they started to add more bonus content and DLC that was supposed to be connected to the show's lore. Like, for example, they started to add characters like the Changelings and Queen Chrysalis after Canterlot Wedding came out. They made a whole stage where Twilight becomes a princess, just like the Season 3 finale. The more areas you unlock, the more enemies you can go up against, like the Paris Riots or the Changelings or the Vampire Fruit Bats. And even when Equestria Girls came out, they made a whole segment dedicated to Equestria Girls where you could dance along to the music. Now seriously, why didn't they make this an actual video game? With all the dancing games that were coming out for consoles like the Wii, I would have played this. I would have bought like 10 copies. There were also a bunch of other mini games, like there's one where you're in a minecart and you're Twilight and you're supposed to get all these coins because they help you with points. But I remember this stage being really good, but one thing that was kind of annoying was that sometimes certain parts of the track would just give out underneath you. It would be really difficult to catch when that was going to happen. I do remember that part of it being annoying. But with all those nitpicks out of the way, I remember this being a fun mobile game. And to the people that made it, my hat goes off to you. And before we get to G5, we gotta talk about some of the fan games. And I'm not talking about one of those fan games. I don't mean like that, because I don't think YouTube would take too kindly to that. I remember when this show first got popular, I remember a bunch of these fan games coming out. One of the first big horror-themed games was Story of the Blanks, where you play as an 8-bit version of Apple Bloom going into a dangerous part of the Everfree Forest, and you come across these ponies that don't have any cutie marks. They're called the Blanks, and at first Apple Bloom is all elated to be with a bunch of ponies that don't have cutie marks, but then it turns out that there's something nefarious going on, and I remember this game being real spoopy. I remember I tried to play this game when all the lights were off, and I thought it was a big boy, but then it would get a little scary. Oh, who remembers MLP creepypastas? I know I sure do. I remember that era like it was yesterday. And of course, how can we forget one of the biggest legends from this fandom, Fighting is Magic, or as it would later go on to be called, Them's Fighting Hers. This was this independent My Little Pony fighting game where you could play as any of the characters, and it looked awesome! And I was excited like every pony else was. But then Hasbro slapped them with a cease and desist and they weren't allowed to do it. I don't miss that part of the show's history, when it seemed any fan-related content would just get slapped with a cease and desist from Hasbro. I wasn't a fan of that. However, in the recent years, the game was eventually reworked into a completely original game, and honestly, I could see myself doing a review of this at some point because this game was awesome. They reworked it into a game that has a bunch of different other similar animals that have hooves going up against each other and fighting, and this game is great. The designs are great, the gameplay is great, the action is great, the fighting is great, everything about this game is great. It's princess-like, it's sublime, it's good. And lastly, we gotta talk about the recent MLP games that have been coming from the recent generation of Gen 5. Now, despite all the flame wars and all the arguments about G5 and all that, I will say the games they made are actually pretty good. They're not that bad. The first of these MLP G5 games was called A Maritime Bay Adventure, and it was on basically every platform at the time, from Nintendo Switch to PS4 to Xbox One. This game basically plays out like a platformer, and they have it that she's jumping around and she can use roller skates to go faster. You use it to collect items, and there are these things that help keep you on track so that you don't diverge off of the path that you're supposed to go. Throughout the game, you do a bunch of mini games, and the overarching plot has it that Sunny is trying to stop Sprout, who's trying to cause chaos and issues throughout the town. 2 years after that game, we then got another MLP G5 game with Zephyr Heights Mystery. This game was on basically every console. It was on Nintendo Switch, PS4, Xbox One again, and it was also on the PS5. The plot involves the main six of G5 going to the Zephyr Heights Gala, and it seems that some kind of mystery is going to unravel as the group end up getting separated and they have to try and maneuver their way through the town, with all the different groups trying to work their way back together and also eventually unravel this mystery that seems to have gotten throughout the city, very similar to the events of the first game. And that being said, there are still a lot of similarities, like the butterfly sprites that help keep the player on track and tell you where you're supposed to go, as well as the magic bits that you're supposed to collect all throughout the game. So say what you want about G5, I know I certainly have my opinions on it, but you know what, for what it's worth, these games, they're pretty good. They're pretty good for what they are. So yeah, that does it for this video. I was gonna try and do something a little bit different. I don't do a lot of video game reviews, so I thought I'd try to do something a little bit different. Try something unscripted, you know, kind of like Swigga with Swigga's game reviews. I was gonna try and do something like that. So who knows, maybe we'll do another type of video like this. Maybe I can get the other fanboys involved, and I don't know. You know, just like a lot of the other guys on this channel, it's come to my attention that sometimes I don't know how to end videos. So the video's over, go home you sillies, you don't have to stay here anymore. I just hope that whatever fanboy game review comes out next time, it is not of this game, because I know that that certainly will not end well. I know MediaWiz wasn't a big fan of it when he reviewed it all those years ago. But I feel like if I reviewed it, I could review it 10 times better than he could. Don't tell him I said that! Ooh!